The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, but the echoes of 4 years of relentless warfare reverberated across continents, cities, and homes. Europe had endured unimaginable destruction. Millions of soldiers had been killed, millions more wounded, and countless others forever scarred by what they had seen and endured. But the cessation of combat did not immediately bring peace, for the world that emerged was fragile, exhausted, and desperate for reconstruction. Across the Western Front, soldiers cautiously emerged from the mud-filled trenches. Entire landscapes had been transformed into cratered wastelands. Forests were leveled, rivers polluted, and towns erased. The surviving soldiers, many with empty eyes and shattered limbs, returned to a world that had moved on, yet was still trapped in the shadow of loss. In cities, families mourned the missing, counted the dead, and attempted to rebuild lives that had been interrupted by war. The streets were quiet now, but the psychological echoes of artillery barrages, machine, fire, and gas attacks would linger in memory for decades. The Armistice provided a temporary ceasefire, but the political, economic, and social challenges were immense. Governments faced staggering questions. How would millions of returning soldiers be reintegrated into society? How could shattered economies recover? How could empires that had been stretched beyond endurance manage the demands of their populations? The answers were partial at best. Unemployment surged. Inflation soared. Food shortages persisted. Disease and malnutrition claimed lives long after the war ended, and yet, amid the chaos, societies began the slow, painstaking process of recovery. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, attempted to formalize the end of conflict and prevent future wars, but it carried the weight of resentment and unresolved tension. Germany, forced to accept full responsibility for the war, faced crushing reparations that destabilized its economy. Its military was severely restricted, its colonies confiscated, and its national pride deeply wounded. Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the German Empire collapsed, leaving a map littered with new nations and newly drawn borders. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Poland emerged from the ruins of empire. The Ottoman Empire's remnants gave birth to modern Turkey, while mandates, in the Middle East, administered by Britain and France, sowed the seeds of future conflict. In Russia, revolution had already reshaped the nation. The Bolsheviks seized power, establishing the first communist state. Millions of Russian soldiers returned home to a country in chaos. Civil war erupted between the Red and White armies, further complicating recovery. Yet, amidst this turmoil, new ideologies and movements began to take shape that would influence the 20th century profoundly. The social consequences of the war were as transformative as the political ones. Women, who had filled factories, farms, hospitals, and offices during the war, gained unprecedented social, economic, and political recognition. In many countries, suffrage expanded. In others, women's labor became a permanent fixture of society. Class structures shifted as working populations had shouldered enormous responsibilities in the absence of men. The war had forced societies to confront inequality, labor rights, and the importance of civilian participation in national survival. Meanwhile, veterans faced enormous challenges. Millions returned home physically wounded, psychologically traumatized, or both. Shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was common. Societies struggled to understand the invisible scars of war. Rehabilitation programs were limited. Many soldiers found themselves marginalized, their suffering unseen and unacknowledged. Literature, art, and film began to capture these experiences, portraying the anguish, despair, and resilience of a generation that had endured industrialized slaughter. The technological and military lessons of the Great War were equally profound. Modern warfare had changed forever. Tanks, airplanes, submarines, machine guns, and chemical weapons had demonstrated that industrialized technology could inflict mass casualties on unprecedented scales. Artillery could destroy landscapes in minutes. Aircraft could gather intelligence and strike targets far behind enemy lines. Submarines could choke economies and dominate seas. Military theorists and strategists began to study the war meticulously, understanding that future conflicts would rely as much on technology and industry as on men and morale. The global impact of World War I was enormous. Colonies and dominions that had contributed soldiers and resources returned home with new perspectives. Nationalisms surged in India, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Soldiers who had fought thousands of miles from home returned with expectations of recognition, equality, and independence. The war had shown the world that empires were not invincible, and ideas of self-determination began to reshape geopolitics. Economically, global trade networks had been disrupted, and nations had learned to rely on industrial mobilization and centralized economies. Politically, the League of Nations was conceived a fragile attempt to prevent future conflicts, though its limitations would soon become evident. Yet, for all its lessons, the war left a lingering shadow. The psychological, social, and political scars shaped the decades to come. Borders drawn on maps often ignored ethnic, religious, and cultural realities, planting seeds for later conflicts. Economic hardships fostered unrest, revolutions, and the rise of authoritarian regimes. The Great War had ended, but the world it created was volatile, uncertain, and vulnerable to further devastation. And still, amid this darkness, there were moments of hope. Communities began to rebuild. Soldiers returned to farms, workshops, and families. Literature and art sought to express grief and courage. New social movements emerged, advocating for rights, equality, and peace. The memory of the fallen became a guiding reminder of the cost of war and the value of human life. Monuments, cemeteries, and memorials were constructed, not only to honor sacrifice, but to remind future generations of the horrors that must never be repeated. The legacy of World War I is not simply in statistics, borders, or treaties. It lies in the transformation of humanity itself. It redefined what war meant, reshaped societies, and altered the trajectory of nations. It taught enduring lessons about ambition, nationalism, industrialization, and the value of diplomacy. Above all, it reminds us that peace is fragile, that human lives are precious, and that the consequences of unchecked conflict are immense. And as we reflect on this monumental conflict, it becomes clear that history is more than dates and battles. It is the story of human endurance, courage, suffering, and the pursuit of meaning amidst chaos. The Great War, with all its horror and complexity, continues to shape our understanding of humanity, conflict, and the fragile promise of peace. If this journey through history has deepened your understanding of the Great War, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon to support more cinematic and educational documentaries. Share this film, reflect on the lessons of the past, and remember, the story of World War I is not just a chronicle of conflict. It is a mirror to our own humanity and the choices that define the future. Thank you for watching, and never forget, the sacrifices of millions during the Great War serve as a lasting reminder that history is both a warning and a guide for generations to come.